Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We've been having a lot of discussions on the Real News Network about the new foreign policy team that's being assembled around Donald Trump's presidency. Of course, starting with Vice President Pence, and then you have Flynn, a national security advisor. You have Bannon as a chief strategist. You have Pompeo at the CIA. Mattis looks like he might be Secretary of Defense. As I've said, one thing all of these people have in common is it seems their number one foreign policy target is regime change in Iran. They talk about Iran as being the greatest threat to the United States. One of the people being talked about for Secretary of State, Rudy Giuliani, said at the Republican convention that Iran is the source of terrorist threat to the United States. Now joining us to talk about all of this, and particularly how Iran is reacting to this, is Trita Parsi. Trita is founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. He's author of the award-winning books, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, and Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the U.S. And he has a book coming soon titled Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Thanks for joining us, Trita.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in the lead up to the election, and the rhetoric about Iran was at a fairly high level. As I say, at the convention, it was the only foreign policy thing that really got talked about. Now we see the team, and the team is very dedicated, at least in terms of their rhetoric, to regime change in Iran. How are the Iranians responding to all this?
Well, it's very interesting because the Iranians have actually been quite concerned about Clinton. They fear that Clinton would reverse back to a more pro-Saudi position in the region, and she has a long history of quite being hawkish towards Iran. And I think as a result of that, the Iranians may have had a little bit of a confirmation bias in the way that they were looking at Trump and only taking into account some of his more acceptable statements on Iran. So, for instance, some of his complaints about the Iran deal has not been so much what it did on the nuclear front, but what it didn't do on sanctions relief, pointing out that American companies are still under sanctions despite the nuclear deal, and that this is unfair to U.S. companies because European companies can go into Iran, but the U.S. companies cannot. Moreover, they've been looking at what he's been saying on Syria, for instance, being very critical of support for the rebels, his inclination to get along with Putin, etc. And based on that, created this idea of Trump as someone that they would actually prefer to someone as Clinton. What we're seeing now, however, is that with the team that he is assembling, he's not assembling people that have much in common with him at all, beyond the fact that they're apparently loyal to Trump. But on all of these key issues, they have taken an almost opposite position of Trump. And it remains to be seen whether Trump will be the type of a president as George Bush was to a certain extent, in which he became a mirror image of his advisors, or whether he will be someone who will put down his foot and say it's going to be his way, regardless of what these advisors say.
Well, there's not a single appointment that reflects some of the non-interventionist position he espoused during the campaign, but most of that rhetoric, anti-intervention rhetoric, was mostly completely hypocritical. He, on the Iraq War, claimed he'd been against it. The statement he made for the war was a little bit ambiguous. He said, "I guess so," when asked if he was for the war. But he was clearly for the intervention in Libya. He's on videotape calling for all American troops in the Middle East to be sent into Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. So his anti-interventionist doesn't seem to go very deep or be very genuine.
Well, I mean, I think the issue is that almost none of his views seem to be something that he's particularly dedicated to. None of his views seem to run particularly deep in his mind. And as a result, it's extremely difficult to read the tea leaves and seeing what direction he may go in. And that's part of, I think, why some are concerned that he will end up becoming a reflection of his advisors, and those advisors are certainly not non-interventionists. On the contrary, they're quite hawkish.
Well, this is the advisors, especially people like Flynn, they're a continuation of Cheney. I mean, most importantly is Pence, who many people think is going to be the next Cheney and actually run most of the foreign policy. And that's Cheney Act 2.
his role model for VP is Dick Cheney.
So are the Iranians not cluing into this? I mean, it's it's kind of surprising.
There's a long-standing bias on the Iranian side in which, for whatever reason of what happened during the Carter years, they for some reason think that it's just easier to deal with Republican presidents than it is to deal with Democrats. I don't know.
Even after Obama?
Even after Obama. I don't know if to what extent, at what point this viewpoint was formed so strongly, and at what point it may actually have been true from their perspective. But clearly, I would think after Bush, they would have given up that idea. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the Democrat that was on the ticket was someone that they had a long history of negative interaction with.
Now, we've talked before, and I've talked to others who know, Iran from the inside. And one of the things that helps the Iranian government is a big bully. The more the Americans huff and puff, the stronger domestically the position gets for the Iranian government. And even though supposedly that the people that want regime change in Iran thinks you can destabilize the regime with all the threats and all this, it always seems to have the opposite reaction. If they really are going to move as they say they are, and I don't see any reason not to believe that Trump and the people around him aren't going to do what they say they're going to do, if they don't, quote unquote, rip up the agreement, which Trump said he would do as soon as he's elected, they're going to start looking for violations, real and more likely unreal, and find supposed evidence. Are the Iranians not? Well, let me put it this way: what will be their reaction if they start to see how this might go?
Well, there's several schools of thought, and I think part of the reason why some in Iran may have preferred Trump is because they think it will be much easier to outmaneuver a rather clumsy Trump administration that does not have the capacity or the ability to be able to sustain strong alliances against Iran or build those alliances in the first place. And as a result, if the Trump administration starts going down that route, the Iranians have a pretty clever diplomatic team in place right now that probably has the confidence of being able to turn it around and make the United States come across as the violator of the deal, the violator of the spirit of the deal, and the entity that seeks to undo this deal. I mean, their campaign rhetoric of the Trump administration, as well as the individuals who are now being named for cabinet positions, certainly does not give the impression that these people are going to come in and with good faith try to enforce the deal. It's going to be quite easy for the Iranians to make the case that this is all false accusations aimed at ultimately undoing the deal. And I think we'll have a relatively easy time convincing other nations of that as well.
I mean, there's been some suggestion in the press coming out of about what the Trump group are talking about. And we saw this the other night from, I'm not sure, I believe it was Giuliani, one of the other people in the circles, that there's other ways to go after Iran without, quote unquote, ripping up the agreement. They can go for much tougher sanctions and wage economic war without necessarily abrogating the agreement.
That is still a violation of the deal, because the deal actually does say that the United States has a responsibility to undo other types of obstacles to legal trade with Iran in the post-deal era. They can impose new sanctions on non-nuclear issues, etc. But if there is any belief that you actually can take these measures without collapsing the deal, again, I think this administration is on a different wavelength than many other countries. The other countries are very worried about the United States doing things like this precisely for the purpose of undermining the deal and to causing it to collapse. Once you've already signaled that that is what you're aiming to do, you don't have the benefit of being able to convince people that your accusations and your other measures actually have any legitimacy.
Now, assuming that they care about legitimacy, if we look at the Cheney model, that was not the highest priority for him.
Those other countries will have to find those arguments convincing, and I think that's going to be a very tough sell, mindful of what they have been coming out and saying. When the person taking over the CIA tweets the day before he is named as the CIA, the new CIA director, that he looks forward to rolling back the deal. You're signaling your intent quite clearly. Whatever excuses you may come up with in order to do so will nevertheless be seen as nothing but that, excuses.
I mean, the problem is going to be, do they care how they're seen? As I said, in the final analysis, Cheney didn't care whether he had a UN resolution or not. And I would suspect in this, if they do go down this route, they're not even going to try to get a UN resolution. They create their own bubble, these guys.
Certainly, I think you're quite right that they may not care at all about legitimacy in that sense. But you're talking about a scenario in which the United States, the P5+1 in Iran, actually have an agreement that these other countries have spent a tremendous amount of resources and time building up and reaching, and view it as a historic agreement. So what you're doing now is not what was done vis-a-vis Iraq in 2003, in which there was a sanctions regime that most countries in the P5 felt was not working and had created all kinds of other types of problems, and they actually wanted to find a way out of it, not necessarily the way that the Bush administration did. But now you have a scenario in which they're actually very happy with this deal, and they view it as an achievement. And as a result, I suspect the resistance to any changes, particularly changes aimed at undermining it, will be quite stiff.
I know you have to run. Let me just ask you one final question. Why do you think this hawks around Trump himself, but Flynn, Pompeo, whether it's Giuliani or even Bolton's being talked about as Secretary of State, that whole circle, why are they so intent on regime change in Iran? You would think over time you could go another route here, which would draw Iran more and more into the global capitalist system. It's the people running Iran. It's not like this is like the old Soviet Union or something. These people are themselves, many of them, billionaires, and would very much like a much more legitimate and maneuverable position within global capital. Why are they so intent on regime change?
I think there's several different reasons for this. One is the fact that these are individuals that, based on what I've seen them saying, actually want to keep a strong military presence in the region. They want to have an American order for the Middle East, and an American order that the United States plays a very vital role in keeping and sustaining. That is not the perspective of the Obama administration. The Obama administration believes that the Middle East has lost a tremendous amount of strategic significance. They believe that the United States needs to do a pivot to east, to Asia, because that's where the real peer competitor to the United States will emerge. And as a result, they want to see a reprioritization of American involvement globally, in which much more resources need to be shifted to Asia and much less towards the Middle East. Under those circumstances, you don't have as much of a problem with Iran. In fact, you see Iran having the capacity of stabilizing certain parts of the region. But if you want to have a very strong foothold in the region, if you believe that the region is still very important and you want to have that type of a hegemonic role, then you're going to have a problem with Iran, because Iran is resisting American hegemony in the Middle East.
And part of that is obviously Israel. And Israel is very preoccupied with getting rid of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah more or less survives because of Iran. So if much of your foreign policy assumptions start from the place that there needs to be a very strong Israel, and perhaps a greater Israel, as often the term is used in Israel, then you need to get rid of Iran to get rid of Hezbollah.
Well, those things are tied together, because the Israelis want to have the United States have a very strong military presence in the region in order to be able to live off of the type of protection the United States offers. And with that, of course, coming things such as making sure that you defend Israel vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and make sure that Israel has a strategic edge versus all other nations in the region. These things are strongly tied together, and that's why you have the Saudis and the Israelis being so opposed to the nuclear deal, because they realized that the nuclear deal was something that would make it much easier for the United States to pivot to Asia, which is something that they're vehemently opposed.
All right, thanks very much for joining us, Trita.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.